We're pleased to have this afternoon as your keynote speaker, Professor Peter Huang. He currently is at the University of Colorado Law School on the faculty there and specializes in business law, law and emotions, law, happiness, subjective well-being, and mindfulness. He received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and PhD from Harvard University. And he has been on the faculty. He got his JD at the University of Pennsylvania and has been on the faculty of Minnesota, Temple, and has been a visiting faculty member at Yale, University of Chicago, University of Virginia, and numerous other institutions. His work is groundbreaking, and we're very pleased that he's able to join us. So please join in welcoming Professor Wang.
Thanks, Tomas. So you can tell I can keep a steady job. And I'm really happy and honored to be here. Thanks to the deans, the faculty, staff to invite me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you the next 2 days in a smaller group. But like Tomas said, I think I'm just going to talk about happiness and mindset in law school, probably in sort of reverse order. So let me try to, next slide, tell you a little bit of who I am. So I know most of you are 1Ls or LLMs. I'm a 19L. I'm also what people sometimes call ABC, American-born Chinese. In a previous life, before I taught in law school, I was a mathematical economist and a behavioral economist. So that just means that I try to use psychology, neuroscience to understand how people actually behave. Right now I teach business law courses, but also, as Tomas mentioned, a number of other courses in different areas. And I guess I'm a recovering tiger cub, because I went to college at 14, I went to grad school at 17, and my mom still asks me now, she said to me recently, you can still go to medical school. I said, yes, I can still not go to medical school. She has 3 sons, 2 are MD, PhDs, I'm the black sheep. Hopefully some of the experiences I'll share with you will be useful, interesting, and entertaining. So these are the 5 themes I want to talk about. One is how American legal education is sort of like tiger parenting. They're not the same thing, obviously, but there's similarities or analogies between the two. And it's not to say that that's good or bad. It's just that I think tiger parenting and American legal education tends to emphasize certain things and therefore, by necessity, not emphasize other things. Things that might be useful to keep in mind in your career and as a law student. Right? So a second theme, somewhat related, is the importance of your mindset, how you approach things. So mindset refers to sort of beliefs you have about yourself and about how the world works. And people with different mindsets and different perspectives have different identities. And your identity affects your behavior, your well-being, your health, your success. And another theme is happiness and what happiness has to do with being a lawyer and what happiness means. So there's different definitions of happiness. So one is this sort of notion of positive feelings, being in a good mood, sort of yippee-skippiness, right? And that's certainly one component of happiness, but I think that's sort of a temporary, fleeting kind of happiness. And a more sort of sustainable, longer-term notion of happiness has to do with meaning, having purpose, feeling like you're making a difference. And lawyers can make a lot of difference, good and bad, I think. And then the last 2 topics, again, are related. One's emotional intelligence, which has to do with sort of being able to understand how you feel and regulate your emotions, and also perceiving other people's emotions. And I'll mention how I think emotional intelligence is really useful in lots of areas of law, whether it's negotiation or trial advocacy. Not everyone has emotional intelligence, or people have different levels of emotional intelligence, and you can develop and practice emotional intelligence and get better at it. And one way to do it is through mindfulness. So there are 2 sorts or flavors of mindfulness I'll talk about. They're related, but they're not exactly the same. And sort of the idea is just being more aware of what's going on, certainly like in the first semester of law school. So you're going to go through a lot of changes. You're going to change the way you see the world and think about things. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's maybe not what you wanted. So hopefully just being aware of it will make you be able to deal with that better. Okay. The reason I think tiger parenting and education are related is because I think, one question is, what is life about? So many things, but one of the components of life is making good decisions, making good judgments, right? So decision making is a skill you can practice and improve upon, forming wise judgments about how, one thing people often say is a wise lawyer makes good judgments, right? So how does that happen, right? So one of the things is through education, right? So what parents and teachers try to do is improve their kids and their students' education abilities to form good judgments, to make good decisions. And one question is, how do you evaluate that, right? You can sort of evaluate that by the outcome, but sometimes you can make a good decision, but luck or random factors just got in the way. So it doesn't mean you necessarily made a bad decision. I mean, a lot of times people actually don't want to make decisions because they don't want the responsibility of making decisions. Sometimes your clients will come to you and ask you for advice, or I'll say, what should I do? Right? Sometimes patients go to doctors and do the same thing. They actually want someone else to make the decision so they won't be responsible for it. So one question is, you want to sort of help clients have autonomy and give them advice without sort of constraining their ability to make decisions for themselves. There's two kinds of mindsets that people have focused on in psychology. One is this idea of a fixed mindset, and the other one is the idea of a growth mindset. So if you have a fixed mindset, the idea is that you think your intelligence and your decision-making and your judgment are all fixed. What that means is you can't do anything about it, which is sort of a very pessimistic view and can become self-fulfilling. What's the point of trying to learn stuff if there's nothing I can do about it? So I think it's a much better way to approach things, especially law school, to say have a growth mindset. I don't think there's a lawyer gene, at least I don't know about one, but I mean, none of you were born lawyers, right? So you shouldn't know everything. You should be happy to learn stuff and to watch your ability and knowledge grow, right? So that's the idea of having a growth mindset. It helps you improve your judgment and decision making, right? And then, like I said already, there's some debate about whether people have one kind of intelligence or different kinds of intelligence. So there's a psychologist named Howard Gardner who wrote a book called Multiple Intelligence, Frames of Mind. So whether you learn music visually or bodily or mathematically or verbally. So the idea of emotional intelligence sort of comes out of that you can develop intelligence about your own emotions and about reading other people's emotions. And that will help you make better decisions and form wiser judgments. And similar, being mindful of your own emotions and being mindful of other people's emotions helps you be more effective as a person, as a lawyer. A lot of times when you think about it, everyone's gone to law school. It becomes everyone who's a lawyer has gone to law school. So they all have learned many of the skills we're going to teach you. And that's not enough to determine whether someone's successful or not. And oftentimes having mindfulness and having emotional intelligence may be the difference between success and failure. Okay. So Amy Chua is a Yale law professor. She wrote this book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom, right? So I think it got a lot of press and notoriety, and sometimes people misquoted her. I don't know if you've read the book. I highly recommend it because it's entertaining and she's very self-deprecating. But the idea is that she has this particular viewpoint that there are different styles of parenting. And some Chinese parents are not tiger parents, and some tiger parents are not Chinese. She talks about tiger parenting more generally, sort of as a cultural idea that I think is interesting. And the next slide talks about how another researcher, Jen Leonard Brown, has written a book called Cultural Foundations of Learning. And she actually argues there's at least two different styles of learning or philosophies of learning, sort of a Western, Greek-based one, and an Eastern, sort of Chinese or Asian-based one. And they have fundamentally different views about what's the purpose of learning, right? So one idea is that learning is to perfect yourself morally, which is a sort of Confucian sort of idea. That means it's lifelong, because you're never going to be perfect, but the goal is to become better, right? And that means you're supposed to think about, how do I benefit society? How can I make myself a better person? Versus, I think, a more Socratic version of learning, which is you want to change your ability to control or master the external world, universe. So that's where a lot of science comes from, right? So the idea there is to cultivate your mind, right? But it's basically to control or tame nature. So obviously these are broad sort of distinctions and there's variations within them, but I think these different views of what's the purpose of learning have implications for parenting and for education, right? And it's not to say that nowadays there are people in China who I think practice a more sort of Western view of parenting, and vice versa. People here sort of believe in sort of a more Eastern view of parenting. The next slide talks about something which is not Amy Chua's book. I think a lot of people thought Amy Chua's book was a how-to book on how to raise overachieving or successful children, right? There's actually a book here called Top of the Class, subtitles How Asian Parents Raise High Achievers and How You Can Too. It's actually written by two sisters. One's a lawyer, one's a doctor. I think most parents, if you ask them what do you want their kids to be, they go happy. But by happy, they don't mean an unemployed musician or starving artist. They mean a doctor or a lawyer, or maybe an investment banker or a management consultant, right? They mean someone who's financially well off. partly because they think that means you have opportunities, and being financially well off gives you the option to do things. But a lot of times, people oftentimes will take jobs which are very financially rewarding, but they feel trapped in or don't feel gives them meaning or purpose. Right? So I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the happiness studies. But if you're curious about this, I think the one thing that that book does sort of point out, which is an important takeaway, is one of the things I think some parents do, presumably what law school professors and educators also want to do, is to cultivate in you, students, and their kids, a lifelong sort of love of learning, right? To think that you're never finished. I think your dean, Dean Arterian, mentioned this yesterday, that the idea that you keep on improving. Melanie Gray talked about this also, right? So you should never think you're done. There's always stuff to learn. And everyone you meet is someone who can learn something from. If you don't know what it is, you just haven't thought hard enough. So the next slide talks about actually using economics, which, like Tomas mentioned, before my law career, I was a mathematical economist. And so there's a book called Parental Nomics, written actually by someone who I went to grad school with. He talks about how economics, a lot of economics is about incentives. And you think about it, law is also sort of about incentives. We want to encourage certain types of behavior that are pro-social. We want to discourage certain types of behavior that are anti-social. So one way to do it is to have laws which sort of, in some sense, set prices. The prices are their fines, right? And so economics sort of emphasizes the role of incentives, especially monetary incentives. It's not to say the other kinds of incentives aren't important, but monetary incentives are more easily quantifiable. So I'll just give you an example. In this book, Joshua was trying to get his #1 daughter to teach his younger brother to do a #1 in the bathroom. So she decided, since I get a quarter for every time he goes, why should I just be passive? Why don't I become proactive? I'm going to feed him lots of water to get him to do #1s. And so she's being very smart. She's responding to incentives, the same way managers might respond to stock options, right? So you can't really blame her. There's a system in place. She understands the rules of the game, and then she figures out what can I do best under the rules to do better for myself. People have applied sort of economics to many different areas, right? So there's a second book there called Scroogenomics, written by another economist, Joel Waldfogel, who argues that you should not give people Christmas gifts or gifts for Kwanzaa or Hanukkah. You should not give people gifts in general. You should give them cash. Why? Because they can buy whatever they want with the cash, because cash is fungible, because you may not know what their preferences are. And sometimes that's true, but I think sometimes people want you to spend the time and effort to guess what their preferences are, or giving them a gift that they really want shows that you know them very well. And then the last book's written by two women who are journalists. It's called Spousal Nomics. So the idea is to figure out how to use economics to have a happier relationship, right? And so oftentimes you might say to someone, could you be nicer to me or to the kids or something? And they say, I'll try. So the idea is if you actually give them like a schedule, if you're nice, you'll get a prize, right? Which sounds very silly, then you might actually incentivize them maybe too well. There's also evidence sometimes that if you give people monetary incentives, right, it drives out non-monetary incentives. So if you pay people to donate blood, they might actually feel like they have to get paid to donate blood. If you think about it, there was a study in Israeli daycare where parents sometimes would be late to pick up their kids. And so they extol parents, please be on time, because when you're late, the people who work there have to stay late to be with their kids. So sometimes this works, sometimes then they decide to set a price. For every 15 minutes you're late, we're going to charge you money. What happened was it backfired. People thought, well, now it's just like a market transaction. I can afford to be late 2 hours or 3 hours. So they didn't think of it as imposing on someone because I'm paying for it. Right? So there's a danger that you have sort of pro-social incentives crowded out by money in the market and financial incentives. The next slide talks about, I think, some of the analogies or similarities between tiger parenting and American legal education. So these are not necessarily always good or always true, but I think a lot of times people are motivated by fear. People memorize things. People obey their elders, right, and revere their elders, and there's some paternalism, right? The idea, I think Melanie Gray mentioned this yesterday at the convocation, that the ABA study talks about how sometimes we figure out what we think you should learn as opposed to what you would like to learn because we think we know better, and often parents, I think that also, right? And I remember as a 1L, I was embarrassed or I was afraid I would be called upon, cold calling and answer something wrong. So whenever one of my classmates was talking, I was not really listening to him or her. I was thinking, what would I say if I'm called upon next, right? So I didn't embarrass myself, but I didn't really pay attention and benefit from my classmates' knowledge or responses, right? So the next slide talks about how I think there's certain things that tiger parenting and American education, legal education stress, right? The idea of sort of analytical thinking, which is a very important skill, but more so than feeling, right? So my guess is most of your classes, you will not have a professor ask you, how do you feel about this case? Because that's just not something that usually people talk about. People ask you, like, what are the facts of this case? What's the holding? What's the precedent, and so forth. But feelings are important. I mean, and feelings are very important to jurors, to judges, and knowing other people's feelings can help you figure out how to frame a case. The idea of deferring to precedent or deferring to authority, I think, is a common theme, right? There's this notion of individual versus teamwork that I think law school tends to emphasize, right? And sort of deferring to authority versus sort of being more cooperative or sort of more proactive. And again, these are general tendencies, and these are not necessarily bad things. It's just that they tend to stress these things, they being tiger parenting and legal education. And therefore, the next slide sort of talks about how stress and anxiety is not good. So the prominent example people give is commuting. So they sort of ask people, what kinds of things do you do every day? And to rate these things on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being very low affect, negative affect, 4 being positive. And the 3 lowest things were commuting to work. Above that was commuting from work, right? Because when you're commuting from work, you're going home. So you're going to see your kids or spouse, so it's happy. And above that was actually childcare. Those are the 3 lowest things, right? And it's actually not all commutes. The optimal commute time is not 0. It's probably 20 minutes because you can be in your car by yourself to sing songs or to chill out or do something, right? But it's actually long and dense commutes, which really people find stressful. And it's this repeated over time, this chronic stress that is not good. It has bad health consequences, and it's hard to predict what it's going to be like. Because a lot of things you actually adapt to. Because commuting's uncertain, you don't adapt to it. Okay, so the next slide talks about or shows you pictures. I mean, those 2 people are people you probably don't want as a spouse, right? So the idea is that long and dense commutes are correlated with divorce, with insomnia, with neck pain, with lots of bad things, right? And the next slide sort of asks the question, why? And the answer is there's an environmental mismatch. So Robert Sapolsky's a psychologist at Stanford. Stress is not good for you. Zebras don't have stress. Zebras don't get ulcers. They don't commute, right? Back in the day, people were, human beings might have to flee from predators like lions or something. Nowadays, that's very unlikely to happen. Yet when you get caught in traffic, you have the stress response. And having it 50 times a day or something like that is actually not good over time, right? So the next slide asks the question, is law school like long and dense commutes, right? And I think the answer is somewhat yes, right? Or can be. And that's why I think the Office of Student Life and the wellness initiatives they're doing here are ways to try to combat that, to try to have a less stressful experience. It's because you can't get rid of stress, right? I mean, stress, and it may not want to be. Your dean mentioned yesterday, stress may be responsible for people making changes, right? When you feel stressed out, you might say, okay, how can I remove the stress? So it's a catalyst, it's a motivator, right? But that doesn't mean you want to maximize stress. So one sort of skill that's important that hopefully you'll learn is how can I regulate or manage stress better? Because you're going to have stressful careers, stressful lives, most of you, and there's going to be a lot of unpredictability and change. So one question is, and these things may sound obvious, and they sort of are, but one question is, are there certain habits that I can develop or change? Because a lot of your behavior is automatic. It's actually not like I'm guessing most of you brush your teeth every morning, every night, and floss. You don't do a cost-benefit analysis. You don't sort of, sit down and think about it. You just do it because that's the routine you're in. So a lot of things we do are automatic and routine. So in particular, whether we eat well and whether we exercise. So the next slide sort of points out that most people, if you ask them, why do you eat? You would think the answer they would give you, and the answer most people give is, when I'm hungry. It turns out that's not why people eat, or that's not the only reason. A lot of it has to do with social norms or cues or contexts and peer pressure. So I don't know if you've ever gone to like the food court at, say, Destiny USA or some mall, where you'll see families come together and they seem to be very similar in their size, right? Because suppose I say to you, you usually have 2 slices of pizza. If everyone else is having 1, my guess is you would feel like, oh, I don't want to look like a pig. I'll just have 1 slice also, and I'll get something later when no one's watching, right? And if you usually have 2 slices and everyone has 3, you don't want to say, oh, I don't want people to think I'm anorexic, right? I'll get 3 also, right? So a lot of that, is like, if you watch a movie or put in the DVD, think popcorn, right? Because those things go together. They did a study where they actually gave people in cities big and small buckets of popcorn. It was actually stale popcorn, but they gave them popcorn, and it's free. And they said, you just have to fill out a survey at the end. And the question was, do you think you'll eat more out of a bigger bucket? And most people said no. I'll eat whatever I want to eat because that's how hungry I am. It turns out when there was a bigger bucket around, people ate more of it. Did another study, you're all too young to remember Candid Camera, but it's I guess like Punked, with Ashton Kutcher, where they had a soup bowl that was continuously being filled from the bottom, so it was never ending. People just kept on eating, even though they should realize, why is the soup not going down, right? We eat because it's there, right? So there's a psychologist named Brian Wansink. So he's written a book called Mindless Eating, right? Why we eat more than we think. If you ask most people how many calories they have in a day, they grossly underestimate. If you're bored, you eat. If you're sad, you eat. If you're happy, you eat. You just eat a lot, having nothing to do with your hunger, right? So the point is learning how to be more mindful about eating and translating that. So for example, there's something called eating the raisin exercise, where you take a raisin and you look at it, you touch it, you smell it. But if you're mindful about eating, you'll just eat less. You'll eat slower, right? You won't be like such a hurry to inhale and throw food down your throat, right? And as lawyers, I think you can have busy lives. As law students, you have busy lives. So you may not eat well. Like breakfast is like a really important meal to start the day with. It's actually backwards. You should have a huge breakfast, a smaller lunch, and even a smaller dinner. But we do it backwards. And as law students and lawyers, you just eat whenever you have time. And when you eat, you don't really take time to eat while you just get a lot of food and just stuff it in your mouth, right? So that's not good. The next slide talks about exercise. There's a lot of neuroscience research about how exercise, physical activity, really changes your brain and changes your mood, like sort of this runner's high. There's just a study today from the University of Colorado, Denver, about how not exercising really plays havoc with your metabolism. And how there's another study about judges who are granting parole. At 8 o'clock in the morning, they granted pretty high percentage parole. By 10:30, it dropped a lot. Then they had a snack. When they came back, it was high again, until just before lunch it was quite low. After lunch, it was high again. So if you're a lawyer, you want to schedule your parole hearing right after the meal for the judge, right? And if you think about it, it's actually quite true. You can suffer from decision fatigue. If you make too many decisions in a day, you're just going to be tired. And at the end of the day, you won't make good decisions. That's why people sometimes make bad choices about dinner, right? If you ever, I don't know if you've bought a house or bought a car, if you do that right after you haven't slept well or haven't eaten, you're probably not going to make good decisions. And it's obvious to say to someone you should get good rest and eat well, but even though it's obvious, we don't do it, and we don't do it regularly, so we get into a bad habit. I bought a treadmill, which for a long time was a $1,000 coat hanger, right? Then I got a trainer who gave me homework. And as a Tiger Cub, I had to do the homework, right? And then the next slide sort of shows that now, because I have Xbox 360 or whatever's coming next, and PS3, and can I basically am my own avatar and my own remote control. So when I get up, and the last couple of days I haven't because I'm here, but when I'm in a more at home or whatever, I'll get up every morning. The first thing I'll do is exercise, and I don't think of it as exercise. I frame it differently. I want to beat the score my avatar had yesterday. So it's play. But I'm getting exercise. I would look silly, just doing stuff right now. But I mean, if I could be like jogging and you could be all jogging, I think you would be all probably more engaged. I went to a positive psychology conference where they had the Macarena break. Everyone got up and did the Macarena, and people were much more involved, engaged, and had better discussions afterwards, right? So the next slide talks about mindset and identity. And that's Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist who's written about this. And the question is, what mindset do you want to adopt, fixed or growth? And the next slide says, what are these two differences? Right, so in the left-hand column, the idea is that if you have a fixed mindset, you think your intelligence is fixed, it's static, can't be changed, right? So I want to look smart, and therefore I don't want to take risks, because risks can reveal that I'm not smart. So I used to say to my niece or nephews, you're smart, then I realized that's actually not a good thing to say to them. Because then they think, okay, Uncle Peter thinks I'm smart, I don't want to do anything that's hard or challenging because he might find out I'm not smart. Why risk that? I've already been labeled smart, so I want to hold on to this label. And so if there's something that's difficult, I'll just give up. Because if I think my intelligence is a fixed quantity, what's the point? And effort doesn't matter because I can't change anything. And if people criticize me, that doesn't help because there's nothing I can do about it, right? And so when other people are successful, I just think, oh, they were genetically lucky in this lottery. They have more intelligence and I'll never be like them, right? As opposed to the growth mindset on the right-hand side, which says, no, your intelligence actually is malleable, can be developed. If you learn stuff, if you have a desire to learn stuff, that's going to increase your stock of knowledge, right? And challenges are actually opportunities to give you an environment in which you can grow, right? And so if you don't succeed at first, you just have to try harder to develop whatever skill, right? And effort. I mean, you probably heard about this, like in some books recently, about how it takes 10,000 hours to become accomplished in anything, whether it's sports, being a violinist, or anything, right? Just practice, hard work. And if people criticize you, that's actually a gift, even though they may not intend it that way, right? Because they're telling you how you can do better, right? And if other people you see are more successful, right, you can say, but that's inspirational, right? I'm never going to be Jeremy Lin, right? But I can practice free throws and I can get better at it if that's what I want to do, right? Like I said, you were not born lawyers. There's no lawyer gene, right? So the idea is that you're all here to learn. So it's okay not to know stuff. It's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are actually an opportunity to grow, right? The more mistakes you make, the more you won't have to repeat these or make the mistakes in some other setting that's much more crucial, right? So it's rather make mistakes in law school than make mistakes in practice. So the next slide says, what exactly is it that people have when they adopt this growth mindset, right? So I don't know if you can see it clearly, because I used a fuzzy, I think, picture here. But the idea is that your talents and abilities can be developed. They can change through your own passion, getting education, and persistence, right? That's the idea of effort. So you should be committed to lifelong learning, taking informed risks, not crazy risks, right? And learning from the feedback, right? And you want to surround yourself with people who will challenge you to grow and who will look at and tell you about things that you need to improve on and work on and figure out how to improve, right? So I think that's a much better mindset. And the growth mindset actually can be self-fulfilling, whereas the fixed mindset can be also self-fulfilling. So the question is which one you want to choose, right? And you can adopt different mindsets and they'll lead to different behaviors, different beliefs, different outcomes. Okay, so the next slide says one of the things we try to teach in law school is to be comfortable or become comfortable or develop a comfort for ambiguity. I think, again, Dean Arturian mentioned this yesterday, right? So there's a book called Getting the Maybe, How to Excel in Law School Exams. There were some books, I don't know if people know about, one was called Getting Past No, another was called Getting to Yes. So this is Getting to Maybe. And the idea is that in a lot of law school exams, especially in the first year, the typical issue spotter essay exam sort of gives you a fact pattern, and you're supposed to spot issues and think about how you can argue both sides. So I don't know if you've seen this before, this optical illusion. So it can either be a rabbit or a duck. I don't know if you see that, right? The duck is looking to the left, the rabbit is looking to the right. So the question is, are those beaks or are those ears, right? There are a lot of these you can actually find on the web. But the point is sometimes there's not enough information, like in a fact pattern that the client may come to you, so there's some ambiguity, there's some room for play. And being able to appreciate the ambiguity and the other side's perspective will help you be more effective as a lawyer, as an advocate for someone. The next slide gives you a link, which I'm not going to click onto, but it's about a spinning dancer. And the question is, the dancer spinning counterclockwise or clockwise? So I'm going to give these slides to Tomas so you all have access to them. But you might think it's spinning one way if you think the foot is the right foot they're standing on, the other way if they think it's the left foot. And you can sort of change your perspective, right? And there's an article called Writing the Statement of the Case, just the bare necessities, bare in quotes, because it takes a look at Goldilocks and the three bears. It says, how would you frame this case if you were the lawyer for Goldilocks? You would say, Your Honor, my client was a poor, starving woman. Yes, she did trespass, but it was out of necessity. She knocked on the door, no one answered. She went in and just took the porridge that she needed. She was sort of put in a dire situation. If you were the lawyer for the three bears, you would say, our home is our castle. It was invaded by this big blonde woman, right? What the heck is going on? Is there no sanctity in the world? So, you would phrase, not that you would lie or misrepresent, but you would take the same facts and try to weave a narrative, a story that would be convincing to a judge or a jury. So that's a skill you're going to learn, but to have that skill, to be really effective at it, you have to be able to see the other side or other opposing sides or different sides, different perspectives, right? So the next slide says another mindset, in addition to the growth mindset, right, versus the fixed mindset, is an entrepreneurial mindset. And again, there's a link which we won't click on, but it's about a book called The Startup of You. So you should all think of yourselves as entrepreneurs. You're in charge of your career. Yes, you should go to the Office of Career Services and you should talk to your alumni, faculty, classmates, but it's ultimately your responsibility. And you can take charge of your career and start on the first day or before the first day of law school. And the next slide says, one of the things that book talks about is you should think about what makes you different or unique, because everyone is a special snowflake, right? You are unique, right? And you should think about what are your aspirations, right? What do you enjoy doing? What skills or assets do you have? And going to law school is giving you a set of portfolio, a collection of skills, right? And then you should ask what are the realities of the market, right? Maybe the skills you have, the things you're passionate about, aren't going to be rewarded well financially. So if you ask yourself, do I want to sacrifice what I'm really interested in and do something else for a while to get financial resources, or am I going to get non-financial pay, right? And I won't go through all this, but one of the things to talk about is a permanent beta mindset. And the idea you have a plan A. You have some intention of what you want to be, what kind of lawyer you want to be, what you want to do with your law degree. And you should have a plan B that's close by that you can pivot to, that you can sort of go slightly change if the market or opportunities arise. You don't need the plan C through Y. You don't need that many plans, but you should have a plan Z. That's your default plan if nothing works out, right? Whether it's living with your parents or whatever it is, there's a plan Z that hopefully you won't have to do, but you should have a plan A you intend to do, and you should have something that's close by. And part of that has to do with sort of taking, like they say, intelligent risks. So in finance and business schools, people talk about real options. So you've all heard about stock options, right? So real options are actual options that people have. And the actual options you have in real life, in reality, come from uncertainty unfolding over time and the idea that you get information, and the information you get should help you think about, should I pursue this option or not? So I used to have a slide where I had another talk I gave about litigation as an option. It's a series of options. When you start a lawsuit, you don't have to finish it. In fact, the rules of civil procedure, right, the federal rules of procedure, encourage settlement. 90% of civil cases are settled, right? So both sides actually pursue the option to settle because it's cheaper, right? You have the option, you're not allowed to drop a lawsuit, at least up to certain stages. Dating is an option, whether you want to get married to someone, right, or have a long-term relationship. When you first start dating, you sort of sense what's going on. You learn information, right? If you find out they're a serial killer like Dexter, you go, okay, it's time to stop, right? So the idea is you have to respond to that new information. You have to be mindful and aware of that new information. So they talk about a lot of things which I think are useful to think about. And the next slide talks about having an elevator pitch. So this is, someone's going down the elevator and they say, how exciting, please tell me more about yourself. This idea is that, suppose you have 30 seconds or a minute to pitch to someone, right? So it's not Hollywood where you're pitching a sequel, right? But pitch to them something about yourself. Make them want to take your resume out of the pile of many resumes they have and say, I want to look at this because this person, he or she seems interesting, right? So all of you can develop an elevator pitch, and that's a link to a Harvard Business School site to help you develop your elevator pitch, so that you can figure out what it is that makes you unique, that people will find, hey, that's interesting, I want to know more about this person. I want to think about hiring this person maybe, right? So the next slide talks about your identity. This is a book called Identity Economics, written by Nobel laureate George Akerlof, whose wife is Janet Yellen, who may become the next chairman of the Federal Reserve, and a co-author is Rachel Crampton. But they point out that your identity, or more importantly, what you see your identity as, affects a lot of things. So the subtitle here is how our identities shape our work, wages, and well-being. And the next slide sort of gives you an example. There are people who are very interested in physics, and I'm sure you all learned the Roy G. Biv when you were a kid, the spectrum. So this says that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So the light is white and hits the spectrum, and depending on how the spectrum works, you might see different only certain colors of it, right? So a lot of times when we perceive things as individuals in our personal lives and in our professional lives, a lot of it's affected by our sort of experiences beforehand, our preconceptions, our biases or implicit prejudices or whatever. And the next slide sort of says, well, here's one sort of case to illustrate how your identity affects your behavior. So think about people who go to Wharton versus people who go to West Point. Both groups of people are smart, hardworking people, right? They've accomplished a lot, they're gonna accomplish more, but they have a different view of who they are. Right, so the people at Wharton probably think who I am is someone who's going to make money, lots of it. Right? The people at West Point probably think who I am is someone who defends the country, I'm very patriotic. So have different identities, which lead to, they're going to different places, but also leads to different sort of mindsets, different behavior, and different outcomes. And your behavior doesn't have to be binary, 0 and 1. It can sort of be along a continuum. It can be more or less of something. Right? And so sometimes people often give the example, I think this is true of everyone actually. You have multiple identities. You have many identities. So like I said before, on my second slide, I'm ABC, I'm a business law professor, but I'm also formerly mathematical. So there's different identities I have, different groups I belong to, that have different cultures, different languages, they share different sort of conventions. And so one example is they've done studies where they prime people who are Asian Americans. If you prime Asian Americans of their Asianness, they tend to be more patient in sort of a laboratory experiment. They'll save more for the future. You might say, how do I prime someone of their Asianness? I show them chopsticks or a Chinese takeout menu or something, so they remind themselves they're Asian. If I prime them of their being American, they tend to be more individualistic and sort of selfish in their behavior. There was another study they did with Asian women, and if they primed them of their Asianness, they did better on a math test. They primed them of their womenness by showing them, covers of Glamour magazine or Cosmopolitan. They did worse in the math test. Now, their math ability shouldn't depend on whether they think they're women or Asian. And their math ability should be sort of fixed, at least in the short run. But it shows you what you conceive yourself as may affect how you behave, right? And the next slide is a short description of part of a paper by Todd Peterson, who's at GWU Law School. And he talks about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which I remember Hannah talked about yesterday also. The idea that a lot of people come to law school with very noble intrinsic motivations, right? Community service, public service, social service. They have ethical personal values. They want to sort of help the world. They're interested in public justice. And somehow, through the 3 years of law school, they come out, or used to come out, with much more extrinsic motivations about their grades, their rank, whether they meant law review. I did not make law review. Whether they're an officer, right, on law review, what was their starting job salary or what firm did they work at. When I was in 7th grade, I went to Horace Mann, it's a prep school in Riverdale. I used to carry around in my back pocket, I was gonna say wallet, I don't think I had a wallet. But I remember, I was like dressed like a Chinese accountant in a suit with a tie. I mean, this is why I dress this way now. This is when I was 13 or 12, this is before bar mitzvah gifts that we had to give. So I would carry in my back pocket my transcript, which had 3 A+ and 2 A's, because I wanted to show people that if they didn't believe me. Who cares, right? But this is what I cared about. And when I went home to tell my mother I got 3 A+ and 2 A's, her response was, why not 5 A+, right? So that's the tiger mom, right? So at some point you have to realize your grades don't define you. My niece and nephews do not ask to see a transcript or do not ask to see anything about what I'm doing, where I publish articles. They don't care, right? Was Uncle Peter gonna play with us? Right? That's all they care about. Next slide. So these are some of the identities I think traditionally lawyers have been associated with, right? A hired gun, a zealous advocate, maybe a wise counselor, an advisor, some kind of persuader. Sometimes I think there's this Rambo style of litigation, being a gladiator, warrior, right? Sometimes people hire lawyers because they want to sort of make other people unhappy, so the lawyer is the agent to make the other person unhappy. And then in business law, people talk about lawyers being deal makers, gatekeepers, transaction cost engineers, trying to minimize transaction costs. And I think sometimes people talk about lawyers as leaders, as visionaries, as agents of change. So these are all different conceptions of what identity you want to have as a lawyer. And the next slide shows you some more novel, I think, notions or identities that lawyers can play. One has to do with being able to help people de-bias them from biases that we all have as just being human beings. Help people solve problems, being sort of more adept at judgment decision making and helping your client make wiser decisions, better decisions, forming better judgments. And because of ADR, alternative dispute resolution, sort of not necessarily thinking of just sort of traditionally going to trial as the way to resolve conflict, right? But arbitration, mediation, being a neutral, just resolving conflict more generally. So this is the last 2 points talk about peace is not so much the absence of conflict. Conflict's actually unavoidable just because of the nature of human beings, because we don't all have identical wants at the same time. So you can't, I think, get conflict to become zero. What you can do is respond to conflict and develop an ability to deal with conflict in a way that's respectful, that's efficient, and that's effective, right? Just like stress. It would be nice if we had a stress-free world. It would be nice if we had a conflict-free world, although that would leave a lot less jobs for lawyers. Because what lawyers do is help people resolve conflicts and manage conflicts. And you want to help them do it in a way that's sustainable, right, and oftentimes preserves relationships, right? So the next slide talks about lawyers as problem solvers. This is a book, it's called Problem Solving, Decision Making, and Professional Judgment, written by Paul Brest, who was a former dean at Stanford Law School, and Linda Hamilton Krieger. It's written for law students and public policy students. But this idea is to help you identify common pitfalls and decision traps that we all can fall prey to, and how to sort of avoid them or minimize them, right? And what a lawyer does often is really solve problems. That's actually, I think, a very broad way to think about what you do. Clients will come to you with problems. Some of them involve, have to be solved legally. Some of them may not, or some of them can be a combination of legal and extra legal, right? So just thinking about how you can conceive yourself in a broader sort of identity or frame than just I'm a litigator or I'm a negotiator. To think about the skills you're learning can be applied to many areas. Right? I think people always say this to incoming law students. You can do many things with the law degree, which is true. You can be like David Kelly and be married to Michelle Pfeiffer. That job's taken. So you can find other jobs that you can do with your law school education. Okay, so the next slide is the third theme, which is happiness in lawyers. So this is the book called The Happy Lawyer by Nancy Levitt and Doug Linder, who are 2 law professors. When they were writing the book, they were telling people we're writing The Happy Lawyer, and people said to them, oxymoron. And that's not actually true. There are a lot of lawyers who self-report being happy. They're actually writing a new book, which is coming out, I think, this fall, called The Wise Lawyer. So the next slide has a chart that looks at self-reported happiness or overall happiness and job satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 4. How do you, rate your satisfaction? And you look at where lawyers are, they're sort of at the bottom of the second third, which is actually not bad. There's a whole third there, above. But I think a lot of lawyers are not happy they're not number 1 at the top, right there, right? And this is, like I said, on a scale of 1 to 4, 3.33, 3 1/3 is not bad. And this is also on average. Your mileage may vary, right? But if you look at some of the professions who are happier, they have to do, clergy, physical therapists, they may not be surprising, right? And this is on average, and there's certain systematic patterns. The people who tend to do public service, public interest lawyers, make less money but self-report being happier. Judges report being happy, law professors report being happy. The people who make the most money doing sort of corporate securities work report the lowest levels of happiness, right? So I'm not saying, what you should do, that's up to you, but you should realize there may be trade-offs you make between sort of financial success and a different kind of non-financial success, which is subjective well-being or self-reported happiness. So the next slide sort of looks at, more generally, there's a movie called Happy the Movie, where they talk about people all over the world and look at different countries and people who are happy, who may have very little materially, but have strong support of family and friends. People who are millionaires who are unhappy because they go, why am I not a billionaire? Right, so a lot of it has to do with who you compare yourself to. We talked about, I met with some of the faculty here earlier, talk about the Olympic athletes, right? And the gold medalist is the happiest. The silver medalist is actually the unhappiest among the 3 medalists. Why? Because the silver medalist is thinking, there for a few seconds, I would be getting gold. The bronze medalist is just happy to be on the podium. But for a few seconds, I would not even be here. So a lot of it is who you compare yourself to. If you compare yourself to your classmates and obsess about who the person is next to you, what their grades are, that's not going to make you happy, right? Because even if you are the person who gets the highest grades, now you're like, well, I do that next semester, so there's always this, lose something, right? They used to have this joke about, turn to the person to the left, turn to the person to the right, one of you will not be here. That's not the case now, but I would say turn to the person on the left, turn to the person on the right, and say to each of you, we're in this together, because you are, because you can learn from your classmates, and you should use your classmates, not use them. You should take advantage, not take advantage. You should realize they're an opportunity and a resource. Right, like Dean Artur was saying, some of your classmates have become lifelong friends, or future spouses, or colleagues, right, or sometimes opposing counsel. So the idea is you want to be nice to these people, or develop friendships, relationships with these people. The next slide talks about different components of subjective well-being, which is the acronym people often use to talk about happiness, SWB. And another acronym, Marty Seligman, who's considered the father of positive psychology, came up with is PERMA, which stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment, right? So the idea is you want to have good mood, positive affect. You want to have sort of flow, where you have the sense that time has stopped. Like when you're doing sports, sometimes you feel like you're in the zone, like you're doing a hobby. So you can't necessarily have flow all the time, but the idea is to have as much flow as possible, especially if you can have it at work. Don't ignore your family and friends, because they will be there as a buffer for you when times are tough. Meaning, I mentioned already before, in fact, just a couple weeks ago, your dean sent me this Atlantic Monthly article. If you want, you can Google it. It's called Meaning is Healthier Than Happiness. So I'm going to talk more about happiness in a sec, but there's different flavors or conceptions of happiness, and one is this notion of meaning, and people who had this notion of meaningfulness as happiness actually were healthier. Their gene expression was healthier, whereas the people who were sort of more hedonic, as opposed to eudaimonic, the people who were more like sort of yippee-skippy, I'm going to eat chocolate and just be in a good mood, or do things that are selfish, they were happy, but they had the gene expression of someone who's under constant stress. They have a lot of inflammation, which leads to heart attack, which leads to a lot of bad things. They're also being prepared for bacteria infections, which usually happens when you fight with predators or other people of your species and you fight with them. As opposed to people who had the eudaimonic meaningfulness kind of happiness, actually were prepared for viruses, which happens when you hang around lots of people. And they sort of did the study in terms of the health effects. The different kinds of happiness lead to different health implications. And the next slide, right, basically says, what is happiness? Or ask that question, right? Like I said, you can talk about this hedonic version, which is the first bullet point. Momentary happiness, good feelings, it's fleeting, it's short-lived. Right, so if you get a 55-inch screen for plasma, you can always get a 72-inch or an 84-inch. You can always get bigger, right? You can always have more. So the idea is to sort of realize that that kind of happiness is fleeting. And some happiness is actually relief of a negative affect. Like if you're hungry or thirsty when you eat or drink, okay, you're satisfied, but you're gonna get hungry again later, right? So another sort of more sustainable kindness has to do with, happiness has to do with meaningfulness, right? Contentment, sereneness. Do I feel satisfied, all things considered with my life? And then the last kind may have to do with sort of a well-lived life, right? So sometimes we'll talk about this like deathbed happiness. If I ask you on your deathbed, do you think your life was well lived? Or I ask you, how do you want to be remembered? Suppose you're writing your own obituary, right? Think about how you want other people to think about you. And now that you're in the present, you can do stuff to get to that outcome later on. Do things that'll make people remember you. No one's going to remember my 3 A+s and 2 A's. That doesn't matter, right? So the thing is, do I make a difference in people's lives? They say we were better with Peter in it than elsewhere. So the next slide says, not just there's like different positive and negative, but there's actually other dimensions. So one is something that psychologists call arousal high or low. So if you go to the top left, it's like this Yoshi's the character there, which my nephew loves. It's this idea of being yippee skippy. So this is the first hedonic kind of happiness, as opposed to sort of the bottom right, which is happy but in a sort of more calm way, more serene. So that's Kung Fu, for those of you who remember, or Pulp Fiction. Just want to walk the earth and meet people, have adventures, sort of be happy that way. And if you ask, Asian people, they didn't think of happiness this way. If you ask Western Americans, they think of it that way. But also older people tend to think of happiness this way, younger people think of happiness the other way. And maybe most interesting, they did a study where they asked people to just meditate for 10 minutes. And then they asked them what their definition of happiness. It tended to be more like the bottom right. So your definition of happiness is quite malleable. And the next slide, sort of looks at the question of how is happiness corresponding or correlated with wealth. So gross domestic product is one measure of a country's wealth. So they looked at the average gross domestic product in a lot of countries. And then they looked at the question, did you experience feelings of being loved? And the scatter plot's supposed to indicate there's actually not much correlation. It's essentially a flat line, right? Whereas if I plotted the more cognitive version, it would actually be upward sloping, but up to a point. Right? Because the cognitive one, I think, makes you compare yourself to other people. Whereas how many times you laugh or smile a day or feel loved actually has very little to do with how much money you have. You can be very rich and no one loves you, or because you're very rich, no one loves you, right? You can be quite poor and you can still have good family, friends, and people who really nurture and care about you. And there's a saying, I think it's Chinese, but I'm not sure, that in a couple there should be an even number of happy people, 0 or 2. Right? It should not be 1, because if your partner's not happy, you should not be happy. You should be upset that your partner's not happy and think, is there anything I can do to help them? The next slide says, if you ask people what matters in happiness, it depends on how you ask the questions, how you frame or word the questions, but also what order you ask the questions. So they did this with undergrads. If they asked them first, how many dates did you have last month? And then how happy are you? Those two answers are fairly highly correlated. Because people think if I'm dating a lot, I must be popular, must be a winner, and I'm happy. If I'm not dating anyone, I must have this loser thing on my forehead, and I'm not happy. If they reverse the order of the questions, the correlation is much less. Because you ask them how happy they are in general, and then as a second, like a throwaway or unrelated question, oh, by the way, how many dates did you have? People don't connect those two things. Right? But this just shows you, again, like they've done similar studies, like before you go to a study where they ask how happy you are, someone bumps into you and doesn't say anything like, I'm sorry or excuse me. Those people tend to be upset. They say to you, oh, I don't have enough copies of the survey. Could you go make some more? You go to the photocopy machine, you find a dime. Those people come back much happier. A dime is not very significant in your lifetime earnings, right, hopefully, right? So it should not make you that happy. And happiness, if you think about it, should be fleeting. Like if you're still happy about something that happened to you in kindergarten, or still upset about something that happened in kindergarten, you need to move on, right? Because that doesn't matter now. All right, next slide. Why be happy? It turns out there's a lot of research that shows that people who are happier are more well-liked by their coworkers, by their family, by other people. Like there's something called emotional contagion. So if you're always depressed and down, people don't want to be around you. Perhaps because of that, those people earn more money. You also have a chance to live longer and, more importantly, healthier. And again, here, like I said, it depends on what kind of happiness. If you have the meaningful kind of happiness, you will live healthier and longer. If you have the yippee skipping kind of happiness, you may not do so. And this is a link which you can click onto from Nancy Levitt and Doug Linder, where they actually sort of go through a class they taught called A Quest for a Well-Satisfying Career in Law School, in law. And so one of the things to take, a free test you can take about character strengths, signature strengths, things that you're good at, and figure out how to find a job or career that helps you or allows you to use those things that you have strength in. Right? So most academics are curious. We want to learn stuff. We want to compare knowledge to other people. So it turns out that fits us. The next slide talks about the science of happiness. Right? There's a lot of neuroscience research. Like I said, there's 2 different kinds of happiness. But both kinds of happiness actually follow from these things. Getting enough sleep. It's not just quantity. It's quality. Restful sleep. Getting physical exercise, sort of this runner's high idea. And different kinds of meditation, whether it's loving kindness meditation or mindfulness meditation. And the next slide talks about something called happiness interventions. So there's a book called The How of Happiness by Sonia Lyubomirsky, who's a positive psychologist at UC Riverside. So the idea is cultivating optimism, thinking about the future, and projecting yourself and seeing yourself in positive future situations. Expressing gratitude, like your dean talked about yesterday, this gratitude journal idea of keeping three things I'm grateful for. It could be small things, like I had fun talking to people about class today, or someone opened the door for me, or I ate something that tasted really good. So it doesn't have to be earth-shattering things, but just like we're going to teach you to spot issues in fact patterns. Spotting what's right in your life trains your mind to look for these things over and over and get better at it and become like a regular thing. This idea of increasing flow experiences where sort of time seems to stop because you're so engaged in what you do, right? Forgiving people who you think have wronged you or who have actually wronged you just because you want to move on, right? It's a gift to yourself, not to them really. Having nurturing social relationships with family, with friends, right? Practicing random or not so random acts of kindness to other people, and savoring, sort of looking back and reminiscing about things that you're happy about, right? And then some sort of spirituality. It doesn't have to be religion, but I think having a sense of there's something greater than myself and something that I want to be part of, right? And sort of have meaning and do something that I think benefits others. The next slide talks about emotional intelligence, and the idea is that you can talk about IQ versus EQ, which is your emotional quotient, and the IQ is just the tip of the iceberg. That a large percentage of your success in life and in your profession has to do with your emotional intelligence. So the question is, what is that? And the next slide sort of says, here's one definition. It's something that helps you monitor your own emotions and other people's feelings and uses that information, because it is information, to guide your thinking and your actions and your decisions, right? And so there's both an internal aspect to it and an external aspect to it. And then the next slide sort of says, you can think about decision-making and emotions. And when you make decisions, right, at the left sort of bar, there may be a lag between the time you make a decision and the outcome. And before you make the decision, you're trying to anticipate what will be how will I feel if I make this decision? So those are your sort of predicted emotions. We're actually not very good at that. I don't mean you can't predict whether something's positive or negative, like should I have garlic flavored ice cream, right? You can predict that, my guess is. I'm not sure what you would say, positive or negative. What I mean by that is people will actually systematically over-predict how long emotions last and how intense they feel. People also misremember their emotions. So the next slide talks about a movie, which I'm not sure a lot of people saw, with Jennifer Aniston and, I'm blanking on his name, Vince Vaughn. I think they were dating. But the idea is that in the movie, emotions are temporary, like I said. They're fleeting by nature. But they can have long-lasting consequences. They did things to each other that made them getting back together very unlikely, right? And the next slide says something more generally. We actually don't know how we feel a lot of the times or why we feel the way we do. You might say that seems weird. So they did a study where they had men cross this rickety bridge. And at the other end of the rickety bridge was a woman who would ask them to answer some questions, say, here's my phone number, call me if you have any questions. And then they placed the same woman before the rickety bridge. A lot more of the men called the woman afterwards because their heart was pounding. And they confused that sort of fear for attraction, right? So it says that we may not know how we feel or why we feel the way we do. So my takeaway from this is if you're going on a first date with someone, take them to an amusement park, right? They'll confuse their sort of roller coaster euphoria for I must be attracted to this person. The next slide says that we actually don't know how we feel because this is Daniel Gilbert, who's a psychologist, wrote a book called Stumbling on Happiness. He says that people actually are happy sort of by accident. And people aren't very good at predicting, forecasting their future affect. So the next slide has a question. How do you think you will feel if you win the lottery? I think there's going to be a new ABC TV show about this, or become a paraplegic. And if you click on, I think hopefully if you click on it, it'll show the time path that people predict. Yeah, so people predict if they win the lottery, they're going to be lasting much more happier, go from 6 to 10 forever. And if you click on it again, if I'm paralyzed for life, I'll go from 6, which is sort of average baseline happiness, to something close to 0 forever, right? The timeline, horizontal axis is 5 years. So the next slide actually shows you what we actually find when we ask people who have won the lottery or become paralyzed in an accident. And it turns out, it's not that the direction is wrong. The direction either goes up or goes down, right? But it doesn't go for as long as you think. It comes back down or goes back up, right? And it does so quickly, pretty much after between 2 and 3 years. This is on average for most people. Right? You pretty much return to your baseline. Because even if you win the lottery, a lot of things in your life will not change. You will have more money, but you still might have the annoying neighbor or the annoying spouse or annoying kids or annoying dog or whatever it is that annoys you will still maybe annoy you, right? You will still be there. You may annoy yourself, right? So you can't go unless you become a different person. Wherever you go, you're there, right? And similarly, if you're paralyzed, you don't think every second, I'm paralyzed, I'm paralyzed. If you do, you're gonna, that's hard to deal with. And like Christopher Reeve, when he became paralyzed, he could not do certain things. Like he lost the real option to ride a horse. But he probably realized he had other people, his family and friends still loved him, right? And the next slide talks about the idea that not only do we not predict well, we don't remember well. So this is Jonathan Sutton in the middle. He wrote a paper about visiting Disneyland, but you can apply it to Disney World, Disney, anything. Before you go, when you're planning, you're looking forward to it, you're thinking this is going to be great, I'm going to spend time with that family, I get to bond with my kids, or I haven't been with my spouse, or whatever. You're there, and the experience may not be what you thought it would be, okay? So you say to yourself, oh, the lines are so long, it's so hot, the prices are so high, whatever. And you get back and you reminisce and look at the photos, all the photos you took of yourself, when are we going back again? Right? So you misremember it because it becomes rosy. And it's not just vacation, it's like Thanksgiving with your family or Christmas or anything. A lot of things that the experience and the prediction are both wrong, but in the same direction and more positive. I mean, the prediction and the memory are both wrong in the same direction, more positive than the actual experience. And there's this line from the movie The Way We Were, which again, all of you are too young to remember, but it says what's too painful to remember, we just simply choose to forget, right? Or else we have PTSD, right? So next slide, we don't remember well because we construct our memories. It's not like we're a perfect recorder. And so, like I said, our expectations and memories coincide, and we want to avoid cognitive dissonance. We want to preserve our beliefs beforehand. So that's why our memories are not really good guides to decision making. The next slide is the last theme, mindfulness. That's Goldie Hawn. I don't know, too young, probably all of you, so I'll say it's the mother of Kate Hudson. So then you know who she is, right? She's with kids. And the next slide shows you this book called 10 Mindful Minutes that she's co-authored. The subtitle is Giving Our Children Ourselves, the Social and Emotional Skills to Reduce Stress and Anxiety for Healthier, Happier Lives, right? And there's another book by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is someone who's pioneered this mindfulness-based stress reduction program called Full Catastrophe Living. You're using the wisdom of your body and mind to face stress, pain, and illness. So the next slide says there are other people. There's a congressman named Tim Ryan who's written a book called A Mindful Nation, How a Simple Practice Can Help Us Reduce Stress, Improve Performance, and Recapture the American Spirit. Next slide has Search Inside Yourself. The subtitle is The Unexpected Path to Achieving Success, Happiness, and World Peace by Chade Ming Tan. So what is mindfulness? Next slide. Two definitions. One is this by Jon Kabat-Zinn, non-judgmental, present awareness, moment by moment of your current experience. Not worrying about the future, not obsessing about the past, just being in the now, being fully awake, being present. You may have bodily sensations, you may have feelings, you may have thoughts to come in your mind. Don't judge yourself for having them. Just recognize them, let them go, let them flow through to the other side. Right? Another one by Ellen Langer, a psychologist, is the state of mind where one senses that the context draws novel distinctions and examines information from new perspectives, which is actually what we're trying to do for you in the first year of law school, develop that kind of mindfulness, right? These two are related, they're not exactly the same, they're somewhat correlated, but they overlap, but they're not identical. The next slide says, who's doing this? A lot of people, a lot of successful companies, right? Target, where my niece loves to shop, the Lakers, the Bulls, Google, Toyota. So a lot of businesses are doing this, either because they think it helps their employees have less stress or be more productive. Next slide says, what are some of the correlates of mindfulness? So it improves a lot of things that are positive. Feeling good, life satisfaction, focus, empathy, compassion, equanimity, being able to accept yourself, being more aware of yourself, being able to control yourself, emotional resilience from negative events, right? Clarity of what your values are, and monetary, financial performance in business and in law. What does it not do? It reduces these things that you don't want, anxiety, stress, negative affect. Next slide, right, says that if you actually think about this, you can have greater autonomy, right, by all these things, which are things that you want to presumably have, right? And the next slide actually has feedback from some students who took a mindfulness class at Berkeley this past spring. So one student says they're able to manage the stress of law school better, right? Anxiety is less there. They're trying out for some organization, which had a mock negotiation. They were nervous. They sort of meditated and were mindful for 30 minutes before, and they did much better. The next slide has a couple more quotes from students. One of them says that they find they're able to have empathy in situations where they used to just be angry and frustrated, like when it cuts you off in traffic. I don't know if you suffer or experience road rage. The next one is like, this person says they're more compassionate towards angry strangers. They're easier patient with their boyfriend. when they argue, which is less frequent now, less road rage, right? So I mentioned the happy lawyer. Someone actually was telling Nancy Leavitt that he loved law school because he was winning all of his arguments with his girlfriend. And she goes, not for long. He goes, what do you mean? She goes, she will not be your girlfriend for long. That's what I mean, right? So you don't want to lose your girlfriend or boyfriend, right? Next slide. So this is from Scott Rogers, who teaches at Miami. He talks about these are 8 skills you can develop from mindfulness: being more in tune, not sort of fleeing or freezing under stress, being able to sort of modulate your emotions, being able to connect with people. Because sometimes emotions seem like they flood your brain, like you just been gripped by fear or anger or something. So the idea is not to have that happen, right? To be more in tune to how do you feel, like if you feel tightness in your stomach, is there something wrong, something that you're picking up? Being more in the moment, being more proactive, and the idea of being more ethical. So the next slide talks about being able to concentrate better, connect with your clients, right? I think Melanie Gray mentioned active listening. So how do you do active listening? When you listen to people, don't think about what am I going to say next or how should I interrupt them. Actually listen to them, be really in the moment, and then reflect back to them. So what I hear you saying is this, confirm, make sure what you hear, what you thought you heard is actually what they said, right? Because you can't mind read, right? There's no telepathy or Vulcan mind meld. So you have to really make sure. It slows down the conversation, but that not be a bad thing, right? This is an illusion of control we have that has to do with not being comfortable with ambiguity or uncertainty, right? We actually can't control everything, and we think sometimes things fall apart and we just freak out and panic. So mindfulness helps you deal with that. The next slide talks about trial advocacy, right? So the next slide, shows you, these are things, like people often say, jurors often say they don't like lawyers. They don't listen to the witness. And why? It's because we have this script in our head. We all have scripts. All of us actually stars in a movie that we're the central star in our own lives. Everyone else is a guest star, recurring character, might be killed off, right? So the idea is that you want to not just so focus on yourself, be so self-centered. Unlike TV, a lot of times people don't like lawyers because they think the lawyers are sort of really rude. And actually there's power to lawyers who not just appear, but are compassionate or nice, right? And present and in the moment. And you think about cross-examining someone as not a conflict, but a conversation. The next slide talks about, again, if you're a litigator, right? If the other side objects, you might get very upset, right? And you might be afraid of what you're going to find out if you ask someone a question. So the idea is to help you deal with or even minimize or avoid completely being embarrassed, making mistakes, and sometimes being bored. If you're really mindful of things, there's lots of stuff going on. If you pay attention to details, things become more interesting. Next slide talks about core concerns. This book by Daniel Shapiro, Roger Fisher, he's the guy who wrote Getting Past No, Getting to Yes, right? So they argue that these 5 core concerns, affiliation, appreciation, autonomy, status, and role, motivate lots of negotiations, actually motivate lots of life. At least one, maybe more, several of these core concerns are at the bottom of any conflict. So they give the example of like billion-dollar deals that fall apart because the CEOs feel dissed or disrespected by the other CEO or something, right? So the next slide says mindfulness can help you conquer some of these things and help you build affiliation, express appreciation, foster autonomy, choose fulfilling roles, acknowledge status. And the next slide talks about how there's certain obstacles to applying core concerns. One is being very self-centered, one is behaving automatically, sort of in knee-jerk ways, habitually, right? Not focusing on things, not paying attention to emotions, not having social skills, and sort of having strong negative emotions. And the next slide says mindfulness actually can help you sort of avoid all of these things and help you overcome the obstacles to effective negotiation. If you think about it, it's not just, you negotiate actually all the time with your spouse, with your kids, with your parents, whatever. You negotiate a lot. Actually negotiate with yourself also, right? So the idea is that you can be more effective as a negotiator. That's really going to help you better as a person and better as a professional. And the next slide talks about how ethics and mindfulness and happiness are all related. People who are ethical tend to be happier. People who are happier tend to not commit unethical acts, and vice versa. If you're unhappy with it, you might think, well, I should cheat. What's the point? It's not fair, right? I don't know if you saw the movie Despicable Me 2. Despicable Me was better, I thought. But in Despicable Me, the hero gets up and says, I want to be evil. Most people don't get up in the morning and say, I want to be evil. Most people actually commit ethical lapses because they're not mindful. They don't even realize there's an ethical dimension to the decision they're making. And this notion that if you want to be really happy, you don't want to have a false sense of what's going on. You want to pay attention to be mindful. The next slide talks about Scott Rogers. I mentioned Jan Jakowitz is a co-author. There's a book called Mindfulness for Law Students. There's another book about mindfulness for lawyers. And they've got a book about how mindfulness and professional responsibility are really related. And the next slide says you can think about mindfulness in more general areas, right? Do you really want to buy the things we want to buy, right? Will they make us as happy for as long as we think, right? When you drive, really be mindful, not like say, how did I get here? Like not even realizing how did I get to this place, right? Investing, being mindful as a spouse or as a parent or as a voter, right? The next slide says, I think a lot of people have problems or difficulties, struggles with learning patience. I'm one of them. I want to be patient. I just want to be patient right now, right? So the idea is we react too quickly to things, and sort of slowing down, waiting, might be something. There's a book by a law professor at San Diego, The Art and Science of Delay, right? Usually, if you wait to get more information, to reflect, to think about what are the real options that are open to me, you might make a better decision. And then the next slide has some links to if you want to try out mindfulness. They're like 2 or 3 minute guided exercises to breathing and mindfulness. Because if you experience it and you think it makes a big difference, then great. If you don't think so, then try something else. Next slide is just acronym that Len Riskin, who's a law professor, has talked about as STOP. Sort of stop, take a breath, be open to the world and observe stuff, and then proceed. And then the next slide talks about what he means by being open and observe. Sort of one's internal, what do I feel like? What am I thinking? How does my body feel? What's my intention or mindset? And the other is like, how is everyone else? Do people look bored? Do they look engaged? Do they look interested? Sort of just having that emotional intelligence and awareness. The next slide, he talks about a variation, which is stock, right? So instead of proceed, consider your intentions and then keep going with those intentions or change them if you think you want to change them. And the next slide, which is, I think, the last slide, says, these are, I don't know, again, probably all of you are too young to remember Arsenio Hall. He said this thing about things that make you go, So there's a saying, I think it's actually a Polish proverb, youth is a gift of nature, age is a work of art. So sort of my corollary to that is we're all works in progress, and hopefully you'll make a happy work of art with your law student experience and in your legal career. Okay, thank you very much.